Hi friends, welcome back to Literature Guide. Today's video is about pseudonyms of main writers. I have already made a video on this particular topic. This video can be considered as the second part of the last video. In this video, I have covered almost every famous writer from 16th century to the modern age, and this video will be helpful for the students who are taking or pursuing NET and SET exams, and they will definitely get some help through this particular video. In the last video, I forgot to add some women writers in that video, but I will definitely make a thorough video on that topic also in future. As far as this video is concerned, I have covered so many writers, more than 150 writers in this video, because I wanted to provide a thorough information to the students, and they won't get any problem in solving the questions based on pseudonyms of the writers. You will definitely like this video and keep supporting this channel, which serves only the students of English literature who are pursuing NET and SET exams and the other university exams in different parts of the country and the other countries also. And I am very much hopeful of getting your support in future. Please hit the notification bell and subscribe this channel so that I can provide you as much information as possible to you in future also, and it also gives me some sort of encouragement from you, and you will definitely do so. I hope so, and be ready for a new video from me after a few days. Thank you very much.
Pseudonyms of men writers. Like the women writers, many renowned men writers have also employed pseudonyms or pen names for their works. It enabled them to express their thoughts more freely and vividly. They could comment on any issue they detested, and the use of pen names could keep them, at least for some time, behind the curtain. One of the renowned novelists, William Makepeace Thackeray, adopted the pseudonym Michelangelo Titmarsh for his children's story The Rose and the King in 1855. George Savage Fitzbootle is the narrator of his three stories Men's Wives. Christopher Smart, the 18th century poet, wrote under the fictitious name Mrs. Midnight. His famous composition is the Iliad, which is a mock-heroic satire modelled on Alexander Pope's Dunciad. James Thomson, great Victorian poet and who was greatly inspired by Percy Bysshe Shelley and Novalis Hardenberg, wrote under the pen name Bysshe Vanilis. James Thomson's The City of Dreadful Night is a well-known poem which is set in bleak and gloomy background. Vladimir Nabokov primarily wrote in Russian under the fictitious name Sirin. He produced novels and poems, and he was famous for his black comedies. The title of his novel Pale Fire is borrowed from Shakespeare's Timon of Athens, while some critics opine that it is derived from Hamlet. Anatole France is the pen name adopted by the French novelist and journalist Jacques-Anatole François Thibault. His works The Crimes of Sylvester Bonnard, The Queen Pidoque, and The Opinions of Jerome Coignard present the true picture of life in the 18th century France. His novels have been written in satirical vein. Anatole France's most famous novel is The Gods Will Have Blood, which implies fanaticism of people during the French Revolution. John Galsworthy, novelist and dramatist, wrote under the pseudonym John St. John. Under this pen name, Galsworthy produced his story books From the Four Winds and Man of Devon. He also produced two novels, Jocelyn and Villa Rubine, under the fictitious name St. John. Peter Fleming, travel writer and journalist, wrote for The Times and The Spectator as Sterix. Arthur Quiller Couch produced his parodies under the initial Q. Dead Man's Rock is his first novel. But, he is famous for his two lectures on the art of writing and on the art of reading. Cecil Day Lewis adopted the pseudonym Nicholas Blake for his detective fiction. He produced A Question of Proof. He also translated Virgil's The Aeneid, Georgics, and the Eclogues. Robertson Davis, Canadian novelist, dramatist, and critic, contributed to The Examiner, and the other papers under the pen name Samuel Marchbanks. Douglas W. Jerrold, 19th-century novelist, playwright and journalist, contributed to The Punch under the initial Q. William Butler Yeats' brother, Jack Yeats, wrote under the title W. Bird. He contributed to The Punch. The satirist, John Walcott, wrote lyric odes as Peter Pinder. His lyrics hold force and wit, and they are written in satirical vein. His famous work is The Lausiad. It is a mock-heroic poem. John Walcott also composed satires on George III. Edward William, poet and antiquarian, adopted the pen name Iolo Margang for his verses. Ali Ahmad said, Syrian poet and scholar, wrote as Adonis or Adunis. His Sufism and Surrealism is famous work. Henry Brooks Adams wrote his novel Esther under the fictitious name Francis Snow Compton. William Hale White adopted the fictitious name Mark Rutherford for his work The Autobiography of Mark Rutherford, Dissenting Minister. Conrad Potter Aikin wrote as Samuel Jeek Jr. for The New Yorker. Anthony Burgess adopted the pseudonym Joseph Kell for his social satire Inside Mr. Enderby, which was published in 1968. Robert William Buchanan attacked Dante Gabriel Rossetti in the Fleshly School of Poetry under the pseudonym Thomas Maitland. Robert Buchanan also satirized A.C. Swinburne in his poem The Session of the Poets, which appeared in The Spectator in 1866. Pablo Knight Brown illustrated some works under the fictitious name Phiz. He illustrated works of Charles Dickens and R.S. Surtees. George Douglas Brown, Scottish writer, wrote his adventure novel Love and a Sword under the pseudonym Kennedy King. The work deals with adventures of a boy. Another Scottish writer, Osborne Henry Mavor, wrote as James Bridie. His plays The Anatomist and A Sleeping Clergyman are quite noteworthy. The novelist Edward Bradley adopted the pen name Cuthbert Bede for his novel The Adventures of Mr. Verdant Green. Charles Dodgson wrote under the title Lewis Carroll. He produced his masterpiece Alice's Adventures in Wonderland in 1865. Lewis Carroll's other major works are Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There. It is important to note that John Tenniel illustrated the two volumes. Charles Bradlaugh, a pamphleteer, employed a pseudonym Iconoclast while producing articles on popular issues. He advocated birth control in his pamphlet The Fruits of Philosophy. William Edmund Stone and Theodore Martin published their parodies and light verse in a book of ballads, under the pseudonym Bon Gautier. They parodied Alfred Lord Tennyson and Elizabeth Barrett Browning. John Banville, Irish novelist and detective story writer, adopted the pen name Benjamin Black. His major works are Mephisto and the Book of Evidence, which is the first of his trilogy. The other two books are Ghosts and Athena. Kingsley Amis, poet and novelist, produced his work The James Bond Dossier and Colonel Sun under the pseudonym Robert Markham. He was influenced by Ian Fleming, and he was one of the members of Angry Young Men group. Thomas Guthrie adopted the pen name F. Anstey for his fiction writing. His chief works are Vice Versa and Mr. Punch's Pocket Ibsen. The science fiction writer, John Middleton Murray Jr., wrote as Richard Cooper and Colin Murray. His The White Bird of Kinship is a series of fiction. Brian Proctor employed the pseudonym Barry Cornwall for his lyrics and songs. His chief work is Martian Colonna, a verse tale. He also produced a biography of Charles Lamb. Cyril Connolly produced The Unquiet Grave in 1944, under the fictitious name Palinurus. The work abounds in aphorisms and reflections. Paul Auster, American poet, novelist, and playwright, wrote as Paul Benjamin. He was under the spell of Harold Pinter and Samuel Beckett. His work Squeeze Play was published under the pen name Paul Benjamin. He also produced New York Trilogy. Cecil Mercer adopted the pseudonym Dawnford Yeats for his fiction. He produced The Brother of Daphne, Berry and Go, and The House That Berry Built. Eric Arthur Blair, novelist and political writer, wrote under the fictitious name George Orwell. He was born in India. The readers can get information about George Orwell's experience as a policeman in his first novel Burmese Days and in his two essays A Hanging and Shooting an Elephant. But, Orwell's chief works are Animal Farm, which is a political satire in the form of a beast fable, and his 1984 is also a political satire. Jeremy Prynne, English poet, wrote as Puling N. He published his verses in Chinese for the first time. His works Pearls That Were, Triads, and Acrylic Tips are famous. Daniel Nathan and Manfred Lepofsky, the two American detective novelists and story writers, published under the fictitious name Ellery Queen. They produced many detective novels and published Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, which became a channel for detective fiction. Johann Paul Richter, the German writer and important figure in German Romanticism, adopted the pen name Jean Paul. His works are appreciated by Thomas de Quincey and Thomas Carlyle. Hector Human-Rowe, the Burmese writer, wrote under the pseudonym Saki. His famous works are Rubaiyats of Omar Khayyam and collections of short stories Reginald, Reginald in Russia, The Square, and Beast and Super Beasts. Herman McNeil adopted the pseudonym Sapper and carved a character of Hugh Bulldog Drummond for his fiction. Bulldog Drummond and the female of the species are his chief works. Ricardo Elisa Neftali Reyes Boso Alto wrote under the pen name Pablo Neruda. His chief collections of poems are 20 Love Poems and A Song of Despair, and Residence on Earth. There is a fine blending of the romantic and symbolic elements in his poetry. The Irish playwright Sean O'Casey wrote as Sean O'Cathasai and produced songs and articles. Another Irish short story writer Michael O'Donovan wrote as Frank O'Connor. His major collections of short stories are Crabapple Jelly, Domestic Relations and Traveller's Samples. They present realistic picture of society. François-Marie Arouet adopted the fictitious name Voltaire for his works. He produced both plays and verses. His plays Oedipe or Oedipus and Irene and his epic poem The League are really noteworthy. Another major philosophical work of Voltaire is Candide, which was published in 1759. William Tenn is a pen name adopted by an American science fiction writer Philip Glass. Of Men and Monsters is his only novel. William Tenn also produced an anti-war story The Liberation of Earth. Edward Thomas adopted the fictitious name Edward Eastway for his verses. He was greatly inspired by Robert Frost. Edward Eastway adroitly employed colloquial speech and natural diction in his verses. Peter Patterson wrote plays as Peter Turson and produced Mooney and His Caravan, which deals with the story of a young man and his wife. Georgie's March and Strippers are his other major works. Samuel Langhorne Clemens wrote under the fictitious name Mark Twain, which means second mark on the line for testing the depth of the water on the Mississippi River boats. Mark Twain published his story Jim Smiley and His Jumping Frog in 1865. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn established him as a writer. The works are written in satiric vein. Life on the Mississippi is Mark Twain's autobiographical work. James Kenneth Stephen produced parodies and light verses JKS, and it was collected in Lapsus Calami and Quo Mus Attendis. Kenneth Miller, American novelist, wrote under the pen name Ross MacDonald. He is famous for his crime fiction. His novel The Moving Target is significant. Christopher Grieve, Scottish poet, produced his works as Hugh MacDiarmid. His poem A Drunk Man Looks at the Thistle is a severe criticism and reflection on the miseries of people. It is a tragicomic monologue. Sancho and Pennywhip are his other major works. Francis Mahoney, translator, journalist and poet, wrote as Father Prout. He translated Horace and Victor Hugo, and contributed many articles and poems to Fraser's Magazine and Bentley's Miscellany. William McGinn wrote under the pseudonym Morgan O'Doherty. He published memoirs, verses and anecdotes under this pen name. He also contributed to Noctes Ambrosianae, a series of dialogues with John Lockhart and John Wilson. His best works are Homeric ballads and a gallery of literary characters. It is interesting to note that William McGinn parodied Walter Scott, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and Thomas Carlyle. Louis MacNeice, poet and novelist, wrote as Louis Malone. He produced a book on William Butler Yeats as Louis Malone. His novel Roundabout Way was published in 1932. He also collaborated with W. H. Auden in Letters from Iceland. The Scottish novelist and biographer, William Sharp, adopted the pseudonym Fiona MacLeod and produced Celtic tales and romances. The House of Usna and The Immortal Hour are his famous plays. The Mountain of Lovers and The Sin Eater are his tales. Edward Robert Bulwer-Lytton wrote as Owen Meredith. He composed verses Clytemnestra, The Earl's Return, and The Artist and other poems. His major work is King Poppy, a story without end which is highly allegorical. It is written in blank verse. We know Edward Robert Bulwer-Lytton as Viceroy of India. André Maurois, French biographer, wrote under the pen name Émile Herzog. He published his biographical accounts on Percy Bysshe Shelley, Lord Byron, and Benjamin Disraeli. Émile Herzog also produced two novels, The Silences of Colonel Bramble, and The Speeches of Dr. O'Grady. Theodore Martin adopted the pseudonym of Bon Gautier in order to contribute to Tate's Magazine and Fraser's Magazine. John Marston, the 16th century playwright and poet, published his The Scourge of Villainy. He also produced The Metamorphosis of Pygmalion's Image, and certain satires under the pseudonym Kinsider. He attacked Ben Jonson and Joseph Hall through his plays, and the quarrel is known as War of the Theatres. Alberto Moravia is the pseudonym employed by Alberto Pincheri. His famous novels are The Time of Indifference, Two Women, and The Empty Canvas. Thomas Moore, Irish poet and biographer, wrote as Thomas Little. His epistles, odes, and other poems is famous, but his chief work is Lalla-Rookh, which made him famous. The 18th century Scottish poet and prose writer, David Moyer wrote as Delta. Mancy Watch, Taylor in Dalkeith is his satirical work. The American novelist Harry Frank wrote as Pat Frank. He produced Alas Babylon, which describes man's struggle to survive in modern times. It is Pat Frank's best novel. The Italian poet Teofilo Folengo wrote under the pseudonym Merlin Coccai. His Baldus is a long burlesque heroic poem. Jean Poquelin wrote under the fictitious name Molière. He established the Illustre Theatre. Molière produced comedies like The Scatterbrain and Lover's Tiff. His comedies The School for Husbands and The School for Wives provoke laughter. Many Restoration writers like John Dryden, John Vanbrugh, William Wycherley, and Thomas Shadwell were inspired by Molière. James Mitchell wrote under the pseudonym Lewis Gibbon. His chief work is his trilogy A Scotch Square. Henry York adopted the pen name Henry Green for his novels Blindness, Living and Partygoing. George Griffith Jones wrote as George Griffith. His fiction Honeymoon in Space deals with a story of space travel. Paul Barnett wrote as John Grant and wrote fantasy books. His chief works are Albion and The World. The American novelist Sidney Lusker wrote as Henry Harland. His chief work is The Cardinal's Snuffbox. Friedrich Hardenberg is known as Novalis. His Hymns to the Night deals with the death of his fiancée. It is interesting to note that James Thomson translated it into English. James Oliver Igny Jr., American writer, wrote under the fictitious name Robert Jordan. His chief work is Wheel of Time, which is a fantasy serial. Anthony Hawkins' The Prisoner of Zenda was published under the pseudonym Anthony Hope. Its sequel Rupert of Hentzau appeared in 1898. Walter de la Mare published his Songs of Childhood under the pseudonym Walter Amal. He also produced stories and novels. Seaton's Aunt and All Hallows are his famous ghost stories. Patrick Delaney, Irish writer, wrote observations upon Lord Orrery's remarks on the life and writings of Jonathan Swift under the initials J.R. Leonard Knapp, American writer, adopted the pseudonym Lester Del Rey for his science fiction. His Helen Noy is a story of a robot. John Innes McIntosh Stewart produced his detective stories under the pseudonym Michael Innes. His famous works are Hamlet, Revenge, The Long Farewell, and Death at the President's Lodging. Bruce Frederick Cummings produced his diary under the pseudonym of W.N.P. Barbellion. His diary The Journal of a Disappointed Man appeared in 1919. The story was introduced by H.G. Wells. Alan Kurnow, New Zealand poet and critic, wrote as Wim Wham for his satirical poetry article. His Not in Narrow Seas is a collection of verses. Gary Armitage adopted the pen name Robert Edric for his crime noir trilogy comprising Cradle Song, Siren Song, and Swan Song. Derek Lindsay wrote as A. Ellis. His novel The Rack is famous. Howard Melvin Fast published his Massaw Massato Mysteries under the pseudonym E. V. Cunningham. John Campbell wrote as Don Stewart. His Twilight and Who Goes There are best stories. Edward Cave formed the Gentleman's Magazine under the pseudonym Sylvanus Urban. Samuel Johnson contributed parliamentary sketches to the Gentleman's Magazine. Paul Anshel, Romanian poet, produced his poem Death Fugue under the pen name Paul Celan. George William Russell adopted the pen name E for his verses, fiction and plays. His chief verses Homeward are really noteworthy. George Russell's Deirdre is a poetic drama which was performed at Irish National Theatre in 1902. The Divine Vision, The Interpreters, and Midsummer Eve are his other collections of poetry. Nathan Weinstein, American writer, wrote under the pseudonym Nathaniel West. His famous novels are Miss Lonely Hearts and The Day of the Locust. In The Day of the Locust, Nathaniel West satirized Hollywood life. Gore Vidal, another American fiction writer, wrote under the fictitious name Edgar Box for his detective stories. John Warren, poet and novelist, wrote as George Preston and William Lancaster. He has also composed verses under the pseudonym George Preston. Philoctetus and Orestes are his famous plays. Charles Ferrar wrote as Artemus Ward and Henry Bale wrote under the fictitious name Stendhal. His The Red and the Black and the Charterhouse of Parma are famous novels. Thus, it is very clear that there have been so many writers who employed pseudonyms in order to express their views through their works. The practice of using pseudonyms will be in vogue in future also. Please subscribe Literature Guide.